Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Gordon Chang, the Daily Beast, the South China Sea. Gordon and I and our colleagues have discussed for weeks, months, the pending decision at The Hague about the 2013 appeal by the Philippines that China had overstepped its authority in claiming the Scarborough Shoal, a just above the waterline pile of rocks that's well within the Filipino territory. The complaint went and was argued in late 2015, and now the results. And the results are sweeping, condemnatory, and surprising. Good evening to you, Gordon.
Good evening, John.
You were not surprised. However, the scale of this, Gordon, it was apparently not something that China had prepared for. The erasure of the 9-dash line. What is that?
Well, the 9-dash line are dashes on official maps that create a boundary in the South China Sea, including about 85% of it. China claims every land feature inside what's called the cow's tongue, but the claims as to waters have been ambiguous. China sometimes says that they're territorial waters and sometimes just doesn't say anything at all, leaving people to wonder what the extent of Beijing's claims are.
We welcome our colleague Scott Harold, a full political scientist, Deputy Director, Center for Pacific Policy at the RAND Corporation. Scott, a very good evening to you. How is the region responding to this sweeping condemnation? The word aggravating was used about China's conduct since the case was argued in 2013. They were condemned not only for their conduct before 2013, but for their conduct since. Good evening to you, Scott.
Good evening, John and Gordon, and to your listeners. Yes, John, I think the region, by and large, has a lot to be happy with in this ruling. It can essentially take heart that China's flagrant disregard and indeed brazen condemnation of a duly constituted international legal body that was bipartisan or that was essentially nonpartisan, rather, and that gave China every opportunity to weigh in and present its side of the case, and China chose not to do that. The consequences of that decision are now coming home to roost. I think the court has essentially rejected almost every aspect of China's claim that these were historic waters, and that China could simply lay claim to them, and that other countries would have to acquiesce in that. Vietnam, we've heard Vietnamese say that they welcome the decision. They regard it as having some implications, of course, for their own claims, but that they believe that by and large this was the right decision and that Vietnam will abide by it and expects China to abide by it. We've seen Indonesia be quite heartened by this. Indonesia, of course, is not a claimant in the South China Sea, but does possess the Natuna Islands, which are proximate to the southwest corner, around 7 o'clock on the face of a clock. If you were looking at the South China Sea, and in that area, the Chinese have claimed that they also have historic fishing rights that are proximate to the EEZ that the Natuna Islands generate. Of course, Taiwan is the lone standout here. Rather unusual position for the government of President Tsai Ing-wen to find itself strangely on the same page with Beijing, condemning the International Tribunal's decision and claiming that it has seriously infringed Taiwan's rights. Now, of course, Taiwan was not able to participate in that hearing because Beijing excluded Taipei under the Chinese claimed one China policy. So it's a difficult situation for Taipei, but really around the rest of the region, there is rejoicing as China's very bald claims to the entire South China Sea have now been repudiated.
Scott, Beijing today issued a white paper on its South China Sea claims, and of course there's been some blustery rhetoric from Chinese ambassadors and from the foreign ministry. But we haven't seen what people have feared, which is a declaration of an air defense identification zone over the South China Sea. We haven't seen renewed attempts to take over Second Thomas Shoal, the Philippines, and we haven't seen any reclamation efforts at Scarborough Shoal. What do you think people in Beijing are thinking at this particular time? I imagine they must be reeling over the decision, but how do you see it?
I agree with you, Gordon. I think that there must be a certain amount of shock. You know, China's rise has been so meteoric frankly, China has been so successful at growing up within this system that when I think it began to think it could ultimately push back and maybe even intimidate its neighbors into acquiescing, I think it has been surprised to find that this is not the case. And you've seen this if you've been watching the Chinese media over the last several weeks. It has been increasingly hyperbolic, finding every graduate student at a third-rate university in a remote country anywhere around the world and asking them their opinion. One doesn't even know if these people even exist or if the names are just made up, but they would get top above the fold coverage in Chinese media trying to claim that, so-and-so believes that this court is an illegal body which has no authority to rule. I think that what we've seen, though, is that China's domestic politics are, in some sense, probably first and foremost in the considerations that Beijing is going to be wrestling with as it thinks about how to respond. Can Xi Jinping absorb this humiliation without responding in some way that makes him look like he is still tough? And will his adversaries use this against him in some way? That has to be something that they are thinking about. But for sure, this is an absolute repudiation of China's positions.
Scott, Chris Nelson, the guy behind the Nelson Report, the Washington Insider email, actually talked about Xi Jinping perhaps losing his position because there's been one setback after another for the Chinese over the last couple months. Friday, South Korea decided to go ahead with a missile defense system, THAAD, against Chinese objections. And of course, this comes a couple of weeks after Indonesia very forcefully challenged Chinese ships in near the Natuna Islands, which you talked about. So it seems to me that China's been having a very bad couple of months in the region, and this just caps off a string of setbacks.
Oh, China has had a horrific 2016, Gordon. What we've seen is that when China chooses to embrace the international community, to contribute to the international community, to play by the rules of the international community, it can prosper. And you can point to even things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which almost every country around the world, with the exception of the U.S. and Japan, welcomed. And ultimately, I think even if you talk to people in the U.S. and Japan, they say that turned out much better because we were so forceful in demanding that China abide by the same rules of lending that everyone else does. But when China has tried to bully its neighbors, when China has tried to ignore international law, it has really suffered tremendous defeats. Now, to come back to your last question, what could China do? What might China do? There has been a lot of bluster. Some of that may be for domestic consumption. We have not, as you noted, seen any efforts to build at Scarborough Shoal or drag the Philippine vessel off of Second Thomas Shoal. I think that the presence of two U.S. Navy carrier strike groups in and around the South China Sea and the very clear signaling from U.S. Pacific Command as well as the Department of Defense and the President himself has really served to lay down a marker to China that they cannot do what they might hope to do, and that's use kind of little blue men, militia forces, and a combination of fishing vessels backed up by the force of the PLA to really intimidate all of these countries. That may be at an end now.
We have a quote from the Vice Foreign Minister, Liu, on whether China will set up an air defense zone over the South China Sea. What we have to make clear first is that China has the right to, but whether we need one in the South China Sea depends on the levels of threats we face. Gordon? That's meant to be passive aggression, and I think it achieves everything. They lay down what they're thinking, an air defense zone.
Yeah, well, they're trying to intimidate the rest of the international community. I actually don't think that it'll work because in the last, as we just talked about and Scott mentioned, there really has been, I think, an inflection point in thinking about Beijing.
Scott, final word. We just have a minute here. The 9-dash line, does it go away? Do we have maps that just tear it apart and that's the end of this ploy?
No, I think the real challenge now, John, is in the months and years ahead, what happens to that claim. Obviously, it's going to be very difficult, very costly for China to completely disavow that position unless it says, you know what, we thought about it and we're not happy, but we're going to abide by this. I don't see that happening anytime soon. And the question will be, what if China simply chooses to ignore the court? How does that affect the current situation? I think there is a risk here that the Philippines could try to undercut its own position in the hopes of winning some short-term benefits from China. And I think that there's a real need for the Philippines leadership to think through the long-term prospects of undercutting their own position there. And of course, if China were to try to set up an air defense identification zone, it would really lack the capacity to enforce that right now. And so they would need to make sure that China does not acquire the capacity to enforce it as such by building a Scarborough Shoal outpost or substantially increasing its capabilities across the South China Sea islets that it does hold.
Scott Harold of the Rand Corporation, Gordon Chang of the Daily Beast. Once upon a time, it was watch on the Rhine. Now it's watch on the South China Sea. I'm John Batchelor.